I'm going to be talking about dyslexia today, but I don't want you to think that you're going to walk away knowing everything there is to know, because honestly, nobody knows everything there is to know about dyslexia. And that's one of the things I want to help you understand is what we do know from the research in various different fields. I'm going to begin by framing these issues around the term dyslexia. And that means that we have to look at various different disciplines or fields and think about how those disciplines or fields define dyslexia, the research findings in each of those fields, and even related terms. Then we need to look at what are the future directions for research, for instruction, for our understandings. Let's begin by talking a bit about the complexity of learning to read, or the reading process itself. This Scarborough knot is one way that I think we can easily and quickly see various components of the reading process. I'm not saying everything is covered here, but it's a pretty good array of things. We know that emergent readers have limited knowledge about reading, but they have a lot of knowledge in certain areas. They know a lot about language structures, they've learned some vocabulary, they have their background knowledge, and they're going to be learning some more. But as they do, they are first going to be switching their attention from one area to another. They have to learn to check one source against another and eventually integrate that. If you look at the pieces of the arrows, you see that the word's increasingly strategic. So the reader becomes more strategic in how to access information and increasingly automatic. They become faster at those processes as well. So what we're talking about with dyslexia has to be framed with this understanding of the complexity of the reading process and learning to read itself. One of the things that I think is important for us to recognize is that reading is a fairly recent phenomenon in terms of the history of humankind. That the brain activities, the brain processes have actually been developed for other systems, such as language acquisition, developing understandings, being able to perceive what we see, what we hear, what we feel, and to integrate those sources. However, reading is something that has to be taught. It has to use those other systems that occurred far earlier in human development. We're going to be looking across different disciplines, different fields, at an identified problem that some people have learning to read. It is a severe problem for some, not so severe for others, but these fields have different methodologies, and therefore we're approaching it through a different lens. It's almost like the blind man and the elephant. And that we're doing is that we're uncovering information about something that may be out there that we're trying to identify, and we're using different terminology. We have slightly different understandings of it and different ways of approaching it. And so what I hope you walk away with is the understanding that this is not just an area that one field of research has discovered or identified or come up with information about, and that we want to see some kind of correlation between disciplines. We want to see that we work together, but we also need to overcome some of the challenges. Some of these challenges are that we've developed our understandings of this area separately. Each discipline has its unique methodologies and unique terms that we use to identify people who have severe difficulty learning to read. We also have different definitions of terminologies such as dyslexia or reading disability, which is the term you're more often to hear in special education and literacy education. In order to know a little bit more about this, we want to look a little bit at the history of how our awareness developed. The topic of dyslexia has been around in the literature for a little over 100 years and was first written about by Adolf Kussmaul. He was a German neurologist. He studied people who had neurological impairments. He was particularly intrigued by those who seemed to have all their systems intact, and yet reading was so difficult for them. In 1878, he coined the term word blindness. Then in 1887, a German ophthalmologist, Rudolf Berlin, was the first to describe this syndrome as dyslexia. And because he was an ophthalmologist, children were brought to him when they were having difficulty reading. He soon realized it wasn't due to an eye disorder, but rather there was something else going on. He was the first one that started to talk about perhaps there was something going on in the left hemisphere of the brain that could be attributed to this difficulty with reading. In 1896, Dr. Pringle Morgan wrote about dyslexia in the British Medical Journal. He was a general practitioner. He and another ophthalmologist, Hinshelwood, started writing about this at the turn of the century. They talked about congenital word blindness separate from acquired word blindness, which was due to an accident. You may be familiar with Dr. Samuel Orton. He was hired by the University of Iowa to begin the first department of psychiatry in the early 1920s. Then in 1923, the Iowa legislature decided to take a health survey of all Iowans. Dr. Orton had a mobile clinic. He went around the state giving medical exams. In his travels, he encountered a young 17-year-old man who was healthy but could not read, write, or spell. He was discussing this young man back at his home with a Greek philosopher, and they decided to call this syndrome streptosymbolia, which means twisted symbols in Greek. Dr. Orton adopted this term, and this was the beginning of a new field of medicine and education in the United States. In summary, at this time, there were 3 terms that were being used for this very same disability, which were all in the medical field. By the time the 1930s came along, the discussion shifted to education. More recently, there are some seminal analyses of the research that have impacted the way that we look at reading disability. And one of those appeared in Reading Research Quarterly in 1986 from Keith Stanovich on the Matthews effect in reading. The Matthew effect points to the biblical reference that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. What Stanovich uncovered in an analysis of the research at the time is that quite likely there are reciprocal causations of either really improving your reading. He called that bootstrapping, when one system might help develop another system and reciprocally the other way around. But it worked just the opposite if one of those systems had a deficiency or a deficit or a problem. And so there's reciprocal causations that he uncovered, that he wrote about, were a relationship between phonological awareness and early reading acquisition. And what that means is that phonological awareness can help early readers in developing the reading acquisition, but conversely, reading acquisition helps them develop phonological awareness. This has a very limited relationship because beyond that emergent reading development, it does not remain an important reciprocal causation. We don't use a lot of phonological awareness to help us when we read now. Also, another reciprocal relationship was the ease or speed of word recognition and comprehension. And the way that worked is that if a reader had difficulty in identifying words and they were slow in doing this, they had to use a lot of context, the meaning and the language structure, in order to identify the words. What happened is that when all of their short-term working memory, their attention was devoted to using that language structure and meaning for identification of the words, they were reading rather than being able to construct meaning. And it's because we do have limited capacity in our working memory and our attention that this is an issue. Whereas students became very fast in word recognition and taking words apart to solve them, they could devote more of their attention to using the meaning and the structure to actually construct understanding. This is really some of the ideas behind the idea of rapid naming that we're seeing in the FAST assessment right now. There are correlations between vocabulary knowledge and reading ability. Students with greater vocabulary knowledge were more able readers, but the more vocabulary they had, the greater ease it was for them to improve in their reading ability. And that has to do with the fact that they're reading more complex text, more divergent vocabulary, and exposed to more vocabulary through the greater opportunities to read. More vocabulary knowledge and comprehension is a reciprocal relationship. That is, if you have a great deal of vocabulary knowledge, you have knowledge of the meaning of those words, and that can help you with understanding the meaning of what you read. And if you comprehend, well, you can figure out the vocabulary pretty well too. The value of reading skill was one that we need to look at in a whole lot more right now, because that's one of the things we've been concerned about in terms of instruction. Are students able to read enough? Do they have enough reading of continuous texts, of books, of articles, that sort of thing? because the more you read, the better you read. It's practicing. But also, the better you're able to read, you're able to read faster, and you're able to read more in a shorter amount of time. One other reciprocal relationship Stanovich discusses is referenced in Richard Allington's work. Allington found that the quality of the instruction for students who are struggling was poorer than for students who were doing well. What this means is that teachers, when working with children who were succeeding, were referring the children to meaning. They were having conversations about the meaning, asking questions about the meaning, not just the literal meaning, but the inferential meaning as well. But for the struggling students, they were interrupting them more at air. They were focused on using the visual information of print, phonics basically, and not getting to the meaning. So there might be that reciprocity between the actual outcomes and the ability to achieve and the instruction that you're getting. There's good qualitative research on that, but not the experimental research that Stanovich was looking at the time. Mari Clay, who created Reading Recovery as a result of the results she saw with that program for children who were labeled as reading disabled, started questioning, is it really an organic problem that's causing reading difficulty? If they can respond to instruction, is it simply that they haven't had adequate instruction or appropriate instruction or instruction at all? This is something that has impacted the way that we look at identifying students who have difficulty learning to read or labeled as having a reading disability. In fact, Stanovich picked up on this, and so did Valentino later in their later writing. Stanovich challenged the whole notion of identifying students as reading disabled through looking at the discrepancy between their IQ and their actual reading achievement. Mari Clay had questioned that, and he went even further and actually found that it was not a valid way to identify students. Frank Valentino followed up on that and did a 5-year study in which a large number of students who were falling way behind, who were reading disabled, were then taught by highly skilled teachers. And of those particular students, a vast majority of them actually closed the gap and caught up to their average peers. This was the beginning of using response to intervention, or RTI, as a way of identifying students who had severe problems and severe reading disabilities and providing high quality instruction to them to ameliorate the differences. I'd like to take us back to the medical field again. And Sally Shaywitz is known for her work in this field, along with Reed Lyon and Sally's husband, developed this definition of dyslexia, identifying it as a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition, by poor spelling, and decoding abilities. They found that it was, as part of the definition, typically a result from a deficit in phonological component of language in respect to their abilities. So we want to take a look at phonological processing. What does that mean? It's referring to the child's ability to use sound structure of the oral language. Phonemes are the smallest unit of sound, and in order to read, you have to take that sound we hear and match it up with the letter, which is an issue because it's not a one-to-one correlation in English, but it's a very foundational piece in decoding. The debate is whether it's language specific or sound general. Pretend you have a mitten on your right hand, then place your thumb on the knuckle of your index finger. We're going to connect parts of the brain to the areas on your hand as a metaphor so that you can be thinking about these parts. So if you look at where your fingers are, that's your frontal lobe. And around the back side of the knuckles is your parietal lobe. And then down towards the cerebellum, which would be your wrist, is the occipital lobe, where you receive visual information. And then your thumb is this temporal lobe. And of course, your arm, you can imagine, is your spinal cord. I want to orient you to this because we're going to be talking about some of what neuroscience has to say about reading and what we see in brain studies. We're going to take a look at some fMRI brain images. What you see in the photo on the left is an fMRI machine, which records the blood flow in the brain and which part of the brain is activated through blood flow. In the photo on the right, we see a technician viewing the images and monitoring the tests on a computer screen. These were taken at the laboratory of Dr. John Gabrielli in the McGovern Institute for Brain Research, which was located at MIT. I was fortunate to study with him and his colleague, Dr. Joanna Christodoulou, for a week on the topic of neuroscience of reading, specifically regarding dyslexia. These photos are an aggregate of compiled data for many brains. What we see in brain studies is that for typical reading, in this first photo on the left, is that the brain lights up in the frontal region, circled in red, and also in the parietal region, circled in blue. When children have dyslexia, as seen in the middle photo, is that many of them have less activation in both of these areas. In this particular study, they've tried to remediate the difference. The remediation involved instruction of explicit, systematic instruction in phonological awareness and decoding strategies for 100 minutes per day over 8 weeks with one-on-one or one-on-two instruction. What we see in the third picture is what happened as a result. So what happened when they got these areas to light up? About half of the students retained the information and about half didn't. And while we can think this is kind of exciting to see because they could get parts of the brain to light up, or actually there was increased blood flow to these areas, there wasn't transfer to actual reading. When you think about these experiments, the definition of reading for these researchers is a little bit different than mine. I think of reading as a message-getting activity involving a book and connected texts. Instead, what they're researching is, as in this first column, or example, do these letters rhyme? Or in the middle, do these letters look alike in order to test phonological processing? And then if letters would be an issue, as in the third example, the children are asked whether these lines are oriented the same way. These are the kinds of tasks that are given in an fMRI setting. Another type of assessment that is used to study changes in the brain is diffusion tensor imaging, where they're looking at the myelination in the brain. Myelination are the neural pathways established from repeated use. In this photo, blue is underactivation, green is showing pathways moving from the front of the brain to the back, and red is left to right movement. What we're seeing is less of this movement from the front of the brain to the parietal lobe in dyslexic students, and there's also higher activation between the hemispheres of the brain than typically reading children. Remember this because we're going to talk about this cross-hemisphere issue in a little while. Another type of deficit that we're finding has to do with rapid naming. That has to do when students see stimuli, in this case as a series of letters, and they're able to have visual-verbal connection. This is currently something that children are tested for. The researchers are really adamant that this is not something that we teach for. It's just the speed you have. It's innate to you and it develops over time. There's another hypothesis where children have both phonological processing and rapid naming deficits. It's called the double deficit hypothesis. Often, people with phonological processing issues cause them to read slowly because it takes time for them to connect symbols to sound. But with a double deficit hypothesis, it is the idea that phonological processing and naming speed are actually two separate abilities. One is not necessarily part of the other, and they both make unique contributions to the ability to read. So with that in mind, let's take a look at these brain scans. The red areas are showing phonological processing, where we saw it before, but the area responded to rapid naming is actually on the back right side of the cerebellum. So if you're thinking about your hand, it's the right side of your wrist. These charts show three populations. The first column in each of the graphs show children who are typical readers. The middle column in the first two graphs show students who have been identified as having a phonological deficit. And in the last column, a rapid naming deficit. The right bar in each column shows children who have both or who have a double deficit. The first chart shows activation for the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, and the cerebellum. And what we're finding is that with each deficit, the brain is activated less. This can become a chicken-egg issue. Is this caused, as Stanovich suggested, by the Matthew effect? In other words, a lack of reading causes parts of the brain not to develop normally? Or are the challenges of the brain's processing causing the reading issue? Those are big questions researchers are trying to answer right now. There are some additional theories that are being explored. Rapid auditory processing theory explores the ability to process brief sounds. It is not generally supported in the research, but you'll find it in the journals. The cerebellar deficit model, which has to do with the motor system, is related to automaticity. Again, it's not consistently supported. The magnocellular theory unifies the visual, auditory, and cerebellar theories. It's assuming that there's some sensory and motor deficits involved in dyslexia. Again, research is not supporting this model, but it continues to be studied. And then there are some genetic theories being studied in 3 or 4 families where there's a long line of people who have been identified with a reading disability. There have been about 3 genes that have been identified which are associated with the white matter volume that has to do with myelination. But again, they don't really know what their purpose is. They just found that these people have a common gene. It's very, very early in this line of research. So with all of this research, we wonder if the spotlight of attention is shining on the right issues. A lot of the research has been focused on phonological processing, but that's where the spotlight is because that's what's easy to test. Kind of like the drunk looking for his keys under the lamppost because that's where the light is shining. It's easy to test if letters match. It's easy to test if the words rhyme. More complex comprehension is hard to assess because you can't move in an fMRI machine. And so the ability to assess someone reading complex text where you have to move your head to read across and down a page is not something they're able to assess right now. The fMRI machine helps in identifying the location of blood flow, but it's not time specific. It does not record brain activity in milliseconds. And the EEG will help in terms of time, recording when the brain first fires, but it's not specific about the area of the brain that's being fired. So there's a lot more questions than there are answers right now, and what we don't know is whether the key is someplace where we're not even looking. I've mapped out our current theoretical deficit framework for dyslexia. The neuroscience theories are represented in pink across the top row. The purple rectangles represent cognitive science, and the brown represent research conducted in behavioral sciences. But this doesn't take into account issues of affect of the student, self-efficacy, motivation, and engagement, nor does it talk about the quality of the teacher or the quality of the instruction. So there are a lot of variables that are still pretty much up in the air. We're not looking at educational research in this particular diagram. So the question is, can dyslexia be treated in an educational setting? There are 2 programs that have been found to light up in the brain associated with phonological processing. Fast Forward for children and Linda Mood Bell for adults. Both of these programs have substantial amount of research located on the What Works Clearinghouse website. However, the research that is on the What Works Clearinghouse website is not specific for dyslexia children. And again, to be accepted, the study must be a randomized experimental design. These studies do not isolate for dyslexia. And so while we can say they show parts of the brain that are being activated, in other words, increased blood flow, there's not necessarily any research to say that it makes a difference in reading achievement. In fact, there is no behavioral research to demonstrate increased reading achievement of children with dyslexia in any of the educational programs. But there's a promising study that was done a few years ago with the compensation brain. This study was with older students between 11 and 14 years old. It was a 2.5-year study. The researchers pre-tested the students' reading ability on the Woodcock Reading Mastery, the Composite of the Woodcock, the Tower, and the Gray Oral Reading Test. In all, 17 measures were included. Then they did an fMRI of these students' brains, and they provided instruction, both tutoring and commercial. They administered an fMRI 2.5 years later, and what they found was that there are some students who made significant progress in their reading, and there were some who didn't. But for the ones who did, they found the right sides of the brains were activated. Let's take a look at the scan in the upper left-hand corner. Notice that the brainstem in this photo is going the other way from what we have been viewing. This is the opposite of where typically reading students' brains are activated, or where there is increased blood flow. It's showing also that there is a lot of myelination going over to this right side. They aren't sure what that white matter does over there, but these kids were reading better and they were compensating for their disability. And so what's happening is somehow these successful dyslexic students were not active, their brains weren't activated on the left side as one would expect, but rather the activation was on the right side. It appears the brain had compensated. The researchers' conclusions are really important for us in education, and that is that we should consider having alternate reading strategies in addition to all this work on phonological processing, because whether it's compensation or normalization is going to be a key issue. This is Manuel Casanova. He's a professor of psychiatry at the University of Louisville. And he said this was amazing research because he, for the first time, found that standardized reading tests are not reliable. And quote, "I'm blown away by the fact that IQ is not predictive of the ability to improve." And so these studies really are shedding some new light on a lot of current thought. The topic of dyslexia is very complex. One-size treatment does not fit all. What I propose is that we have further research on personalized interventions in order to help these students with a highly qualified teacher. So as I summarize what we've talked about so far, because you're going to walk away with more questions than you came with, that hopefully they're different and more important and at a deeper level. But each discipline we've talked about, neuroscience, medicine, education, both literacy and special education, have unique research methodologies. They each are looking at slightly different things. They have unique terminology and definitions: dyslexia, reading disability, learning disability, and different ways of identifying whether or not someone has dyslexia. Whether you use an fMRI or a DTI or EEG, which are not going to be put in every school building. And then we have the CTOP and rapid naming, which are administered in special education. Norton and Wolf, who've done a lot of research in this area and have written a great deal about this, say there's no single test or criteria for diagnosing dyslexia. Now I want to add the field of psychiatry to the discussion. The DSM-5, which is the reference for psychiatrists to use to actually identify students, because it's the psychiatrists who attach the term dyslexia to the problem, not educators. And in the DSM-5, dyslexia is not a separate diagnosis. There have been some people in the field who have criticized that, but there are so many different definitions and so much different research that right now there's not this confluence of understanding and bring it all together. So it all fits under specific learning disorder. Response to intervention, or RTI, or MTSS in Iowa, which is an educational way of identifying students who have severe reading problems. Again, different lenses, slightly different information. We're trying to bring this together. There's a whole area of research called educational neuroscience, but there's challenges to that. Are we talking about the same things in the same terms, or are we talking about the same things and using different terms? Do we really understand each other's methodologies? We're working on that, but that's important. So in fact, this is the language from the DSM-5. If the diagnosis is a learning disability with an impairment in reading, and note the note in pink where they're addressing dyslexia, but it's not a separate diagnosis. Again, from Norton and Wolf, you know there's been over 100 years of research in developing an understanding of reading difficulties, but we haven't come up with one single explanation, and probably won't, because there may be a combination of things that are impacting this. But also, there's not one single symptom or set of symptoms for dyslexia. There's a lot more research that needs to be done. We need to understand what it is. We need to understand what effective instructional practices are. And we need to remember that even though some show some promise, the intensive instruction that I referred to earlier, the 8-week program where students had instruction for 100 minutes a day, showed there was a difference for those who had instruction, but it only remained for a year or two for about half of the kids. So in the long term, it may not be the best way forward. The next couple slides are from Peter Offelbach. Again, just like the drunk looking for his keys in the streetlight when the keys are over in the dark, we have funded and we've done a lot of research looking at skills and strategies in reading and a lot about phonics instruction, phonological awareness. But some of these other areas have had less attention and they may be very much impacting this. If kids are not engaged in the learning process, who have struggled year after year, who are on the verge of dropping out of school, if they don't want to read and they don't want to write, this carries on year after year. We're not just talking about an isolated incident in kindergarten or first grade with a struggling student. We need to build on what they can do. We need to get them engaged in the learning process. And yes, they do need to learn how to read, but they're going to have much better success rate if they're the ones that are driving the engine of that success rather than being forced to do things that don't make sense to them. And then again, there may be some reciprocal relationships between some of these things too. I really believe very strongly there's a reciprocal relationship between self-efficacy, sense of agency, and then engagement and motivation, and that they make a great deal of difference in how much children actually achieve because of the volumes of reading they do when they're motivated. The International Literacy Association has a group of researchers who came together to review research on dyslexia and publish this research advisory. Some of the statements are important. There's no certifiable best method for teaching these children. The Research Advisory Committee called for a research agenda that will look for evidence-based methods for teaching children. Also, we need to have more research on the causes of dyslexia, but also thinking that perhaps it's not just neurological or genetic or just an instructional issue, but there may be a combination of these things going on. Also, it's important to recognize that a large number of children who initially have reading disability, that through good, high-quality instruction from a very well-trained teacher can actually catch up to their peers and not have problems later on. That's what reading recovery is about. There are other interventions that are about the very thing too. And there are other interventions that are showing a great deal of promise in this area. We can actually reduce that percentage of students who have severe trouble learning to read to about 2% of the population. And quite honestly, in New Zealand, it's reduced to 0.5% of the total student population. We need to do more than just research decoding interventions. We need to look at other things too. And I think one of the areas is looking at the compensatory ways of processing print. And there's other ways of teaching that might be more productive than simply trying to teach someone to do something that's the hardest for them to learn. If you're born with a genetic deficiency in being able to hear sounds and words, perhaps after you've had some instruction trying to help you to do that, the best mode is to move on and ask, is there another way that you can have a compensatory way of learning to read? We have to think about the children and their other strengths. If they have a deficit, maybe they have other strengths that can help compensate, or we can build on that. But the best way that we can make a difference for these children is to have teachers who are highly, highly qualified, which means they have professional training, experience, and very responsive to the students, so they can adjust their instruction based on their knowledge and based on what they see the student doing. They have to have the freedom to act on that. When required to use prescribed scripted programs, the more restrictive the curriculum is, the less the teacher can actually use the skill and knowledge she has or he has to adjust the instruction. So we've got to be very careful that we aren't mandating things that are actually causing more problems, with the best of intentions that they may be causing more problems than simply allowing teachers to use their best judgment. But they do need to have the skill to do so. You probably have many, many more questions about dyslexia. And so on Wednesday, when you connect with your partner via Zoom, I'd like you to explore various websites listed on your reading schedule. You'll find quite a variety of information there, and you'll want to discuss your findings with each other. Then I also encourage you to read the ILA, the International Literacy Association response to the International Dyslexic Association. You're going to need to be looking at that website first before you read the response so that it makes sense. And then by Friday, you want to summarize all of the information from all the sources and write an individual response, probably be about 4 to 5 pages in this dyslexia paper. While you may draw from your teaching experiences, be sure you consider your role as a literacy specialist when crafting your responses. The following guidelines will help you complete a well-written response. Part 1, you're going to write a brief synthesis. Your essential question is, what did the professional literature have to say about this topic? And by professional literature, I also want you to think about the websites, because these are professional organizations that have provided these. In 2 to 3 paragraphs, draw together particular themes or traits that you observe in the texts. Highlight the similarities or differences between the various texts in ways that are as informative as possible. Part 2, you write a response. The essential question here is, what do you think about this as a teacher? What do you think about this as a literacy specialist? You'll address both questions separately. Cite your reactions, feelings, and analysis of your readings in a more personal way. Include your questions, your personal connections to what you read, the link that this reading has to do with what you already know, what was confusing, interesting, important, or surprising to you. Be sure to refer directly to specific passages or quotes in the material that inspire these thoughts, and remember to cite them according to APA 6th edition. And then part 3, write about the impact. The essential question here is, what impact has this reading had on you? What implications does this have for your work as a literacy specialist? This is the so what part. Think about what you know, your new knowledge. This is your learning. What difference did this reading have on your thinking? What conclusions have you come to, and why? And then upload the document to e-learning. We will be back in Zoomland on June 18th at 4:30 p.m. We'll see you then.